new things, right? And so, like, for example, like, you know, I can speak for my own identity, thinking about, like, being a person of color, and also being a queer person means that, it's not like sometimes I'm oppressed for being queer and sometimes I'm oppressed for being black. It's like they happen at the same time, and then they create this new thing that makes it even more difficult, right? And so this is like kind of a play of like, we like to compartmentalize things, but then when you actually see it compartmentalized, you realize like, oh, it's actually not that simple. Like, it's like we're so mashed up, they're really entangled. So part of that is like kind of thinking about, okay, like where do you sit, and what does that mean for like, you know, like if you know that you're in a dominant group, for example, like then what does liberation work look like if you're working with communities that are not your own, right? Versus if you're working with communities, right? So like what you said before of like liberating the oppressor, right? Like a white person doing work with other white people about whiteness is different than a white person doing work with people of color around solidarity work, right? Both are important and are needed. Both take different resources, right? And so kind of getting clear about what is my positionality and therefore what is my work, and knowing that it's not, oh, my work is just my work. It's like, no, it's contextual. It depends on who I'm working with, why I'm working with them, and how. Cool. Any questions, comments? What was it like to do that activity? Not like the content, but like, what was it like? How did it make you feel?
I felt like pretty uncomfortable, but also like to that, like it was also like healing in a way. Like whoa, yeah. Like it's really good to think about, and like, yeah.
Cool.
I thought it was very informing because when there's discomfort, that's a red flag. There's work to be done, and that's important to be pointed out to me.
Totally.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, it was interesting how like all these are uncomfortable when I think of going to them by myself, but then like when there's a group of people, like it did, like even in our dynamic in the group, like it was like, oh yeah, I'm in this majority, and somehow that makes it easier for me to be vulnerable. Even though when I'm out by myself in the world, those things might feel more vulnerable because I'm not surrounded by people like me.
Absolutely, right. Context really is everything in how we negotiate with power, how we get to access it, how we don't, how we prioritize safety, right? And so I think that is huge, for sure. Thank you for sharing that. Any other observations on?
Yeah, so one feeling when I was over in Gender with all this good company, I felt pretty good.
Yeah.
You know, I felt a little better. And then sometimes I'd be thinking about like not just how I identify, but if I stand under a certain sign, you know, I'm like saying this is how you can. This is a label you're going to put on me. And I didn't like that. You know, I mean, because we do that too.
Totally.
You know?
Totally.
So it's not just what we're thinking is like how are other people seeing us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And thank you for that, because I think that's part of like the practice of vulnerability in that, right? Is that it's not just like we can go through all this inner turmoil about how we see ourselves, and also we have to deal with being in the world, right? And how people perceive that and project onto us, right? And so when those things can be projected, it can be really scared to step into that, because you're like, that's only one piece of this, right? Like if all of these make up and you're like harping on this one thing, you're like missing these other things about me, right? And I think it's a both and, right? Because I think it's like you said, it's like the discomfort means like, oh, there's some growing to do, but also like, what does it mean when we live in a society that tells us like vulnerability is bad? Vulnerability is weak, right? And it's like, especially as like healers, and people are hoping to help people get well, people have to be able to be vulnerable to come to you, right? Like I'm sure you see lots of people who are in vulnerable positions, whether because they just physically are not well or the other conditions that prevent them to even trying to get to your clinic, right? So those all things are part of it too. Yeah, and I think it's always like a both and. We're doing both and all the time, for sure. Cool. Any questions, or switch gears a little bit? Okay, cool. So, we're going to talk about praxis. That's the word that we keep saying, but I was like, it won't become it. So, somebody tell me, what do you think praxis means? Has anybody heard of this word? It's used a lot. I will say, Polka uses it a lot, probably a little too much, but that's for after the recording's over. Yeah, I mean, I do think it is something that, in people who are doing liberatory work, this word praxis comes up all the time, but what does it actually mean? Anybody?
Well, you just tried to tell me, so I'll try to
Okay.
say it, and then you can point out where I'm getting it wrong. Okay, so there's praxis, there's practice, and then there's your compass that kind of guides you in your practice. And so praxis is the space between where you evaluate your actions and your compass and the movement between those things. And if your actions aren't reflecting your beliefs, then you need to change. Your praxis is what inspires you to change your beliefs or your actions in order that they line up.
Yes. Great.
You get it?
So now, I know that was a lot, right?
Noun.
It's a noun, yes.
Okay.
It is a person, place, or thing, yes. Bless. Okay, that was a great job. And now I'm going to break it down so that you all know what the hell she just said.
Good.
Okay. So, the kind of quick and dirty is that praxis is theory plus practice. That's the quick and dirty, right? The other one is also labeled as action and reflection. So the lineage of praxis that I use is Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, great book. Though now when I read it, I'm always like, this is like, I mean, he's a philosopher, so it is very theoretical. But I do think that there's this kind of, yeah, I think that it is a way to kind of think about, let me move back. So I think, so when Paulo Freire talks about oppressed people, he's kind of talking about the thing that we talked about with our identities just now, that being oppressed is a positionality, right? It's not like I'm a bad person, I'm oppressed, or we have a lot of victim blaming narratives in our country, right? That like, you're oppressed because you didn't work hard enough, and if you just would have pulled yourself by your bootstraps, you wouldn't be in this problem, right? It's very individual, right? And so understanding that being oppressed isn't because you did something wrong, it's because you live within systems of oppression and you just happen to be the target of that, right? Mm-hmm. And so when Paulo Freire talks about being oppressed, it's a positionality, meaning like we're working towards liberation so that you're not in that position anymore. Mm-hmm. That it is not because you are inherently who you are that you must be oppressed, it's that we live in a condition that if we change, you get to self-determine, right? So when I think about action and reflection, it's like, it's the practices in which the action that we're doing to change things, but also reflecting about it, right? So, okay, work with me here. I'm a school nerd, I'm a research nerd, right? So when we think about research, we think about big M and little m. Big M is methodology, and little m is methods. So I think of little m as practice, right? It's like a method. It's the tool that you're actually using to do whatever you're trying to do, right? That's what your method is. Your big M, your methodology, is why you use those tools, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like one thing to use the tool, but like, why use the tool? What's the tool for? How does it make an impact? That's the methodology, right? So when I think about praxis, I think about practice is being the little m. It's the thing that you actually do, right? It's the things you do in your clinic to make sure that people feel comfortable. It's the things that you do to like keep your pay structure. It's the thing that you do to, right, like those practices. Whereas in theory, the methodology, the why, is kind of like, what are my commitments, right? So if we're saying that we're committed to liberation, we'll use what Leah offered, right? Like understanding that these groups of people experience these, are impacted by these systems of oppression, and I want to, like, my work is to center those people in my practice, right? That is a political commitment. And that is kind of theory, right? People think theory is this lofty thing, but it's like, no, it's like the ideas in which you're working from, right? So your commitment is your theory, right? So commitment, theory, right? And then your practices are like, what are the things you do? That's P, practices, right? What are the things you do in your everyday life, right? Those are your practices, right? So oftentimes when people talk about praxis, they use it interchangeably with practice. They're not the same thing. Because what it ultimately is that if you have this commitment, you have to say, cool, what are my everyday practices that I do to make this commitment happen, right? And then you have to reflect. You have to say, okay, are my everyday practices actually in alignment with my commitments? Not all the time. You know why? Because we're humans, right? So it's like, no, it's not. So then I have to reflect and come back to my commitment. This feed loop, that's praxis. So it's not one or the other. It's not the pole. It's the relationship between the two. That's what your praxis. So that's the thing of praxis, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? So I always think about, like, what are our commitments, as practitioners or community healers? What are our commitments? What are the practices in our everyday life? And what's our process to reflect on whether we're honoring those commitments, right? So the thing is like, sometimes we're like, oh yeah, it's working. And then someone jumps out of nowhere and goes, hey, like, this thing that is happening at your clinic, like, feels like it's a barrier for me to coming in, right? Mm-hmm. And you'd be like, but my practices align with my values, what do you mean, right? And so it's like that reflection of going, okay, now we have to adjust something. That's your praxis, coming back to your ideas, because your theory is like your compass. So that's the thing that Jessica said about your compass, right? Your theory is like, so if we understand that, like, white supremacy exists, right? Like, I know that people, when we say theory, people are like, oh, it's not real. I just really want us to reclaim what theory means. Sorry, that's like the scholar in me. It's like, come on, ideas aren't bad, people. It's about what people do with ideas, right? And so, like, your compass is like, if you're like, okay, if we know white supremacy is bad, it's not something we want to do in our practice. Like, that's the thing about, like, when we're noticing, like, oh, are these instances of racism coming up? Oh, if we check back with how we understand white supremacy, that helps us understand. That's our compass. Like, it's bringing us back to, are you actually honoring this, right? But if you don't know the idea behind it, if you don't know, like, if you're not thinking about systems of oppression, it's not going to translate in that same way, right? So that's what kind of your compass to, like, am I doing this or not, right? And this, like, kind of like, if this is your theory and you're like, ooh, even that, like, process, that's your praxis. So I always think it's like, praxis is a practice, which is kind of meta and kind of funny, right? Because it is a practice. It's something you have to do over and over to get better at, right? It's something that you have to, right? I'm sure you all know, like, the first time you needle a body versus when you're, like, deep in it for a while, it's embodied, right? You have a different understanding of it. You could probably do it with your eyes closed. I can teach somebody a Sunday salutation with my eyes closed now. Should I? Probably not, but I could, right? And so that's that kind of, like, constantly coming back to it. It is a practice that you have to come back to, but it is something that I think can really work towards change, because you're constantly reflecting what you're doing. Understanding that perfection isn't real. Like, we're humans. Perfection isn't something attainable. It's something that we're always working towards to move and get better. Any other questions about praxis? Cool. Okay, so moving along. Great. We got about 30 minutes left. We're doing good. Okay, so now I want us to take the time. This is when we're going to have, you're going to be more in conversation, and we're going to start thinking about some of the ways that we're seeing some of these issues coming up in your own practice, right? So, like, part of it is, like, we have to make it tangible, right? We have lots of ideas about how systems of oppression work, but, like, how does it actually look in the context of you providing acupuncture or being in healing spaces as a community healer, right? So based on the kind of, we have these identity markers on the wall, I want you to use those to kind of be like, what are some issues of ability that come up at my clinic or my practice or in the folks that I'm working with? What are some issues of citizenship? What are some issues of age? Or blah, blah, blah. And kind of identifying the real kind of things that happen real time in your spaces that you're practicing in. So we'll start there. We'll start with, let's do pairs again. And just share some of, and use this as a time to share stories, right? So I think part of this is understanding, like, these things that we all learned about today, you already know. I'm just giving you different language for it. So now this is the time for you to identify, like, where it shows up in your life already. Share examples, share stories, concerns. Take that, and then we'll take some time to do that, and then we'll bring that back and harvest some of those things so that everybody has that kind of collective information. And then we'll use the last bit of our time to kind of talk about what might be some barriers are and what our commitments moving forward might look like. Cool? Cool.